very dynamite show.
Out of sight, yeah. Listen, are you hung up?
Why don't you knock it off with them negative waves? Why don't you dig how beautiful it is out here? Why don't you say something righteous and hopeful for a change?
From the compound in Brooklyn, this is Mr. Haney's Truck, originally titled Compound Conversations, but unfortunately I found out that was taken already, and to avoid any legal hassles, I changed the name. So this podcast won't concentrate on any one theme or topic, but I hope it to be wide-ranging with sometimes interviews, sometimes rotating co-hosts, and the topics are going to range from the curious to the kooky. And tonight's first episode is with New York writer Arthur Nersessian. He's a longtime friend of the compound who agreed to be the guinea pig for this first outing. He was born and raised in Manhattan, and he received his master's degree from City College back in the days when they let anyone in. And after that, he became a shut-in, spent all his time writing while all the cool kids were outside goofing off. That resulted in 11 New York-centric books, among which are The Fuck Up, this first one, Dog Run, Manhattan Loverboy, Suicide Casanova, Chinese Takeout, and his latest novel, Gladys of the Hunt. So let's meander into the compound and have a conversation with Arthur Nersessian. All right, here we go. Okay, tonight on the premiere episode of our podcast, I have Arthur Nersessian, New York City-born writer, born and reared in Manhattan. So you have 11 books out.
11, yeah.
And I remember your first book, The Fuck Up, when you gave me the manuscript to read, I refused to read it.
It's true.
Because I was afraid if it sucked, I didn't want to have to tell you that it sucked.
Very cowardly of you.
And then what happened with The Fuck Up?
It became huge. It sold over 120,000 copies, and it went to a major press, and I became a star, and I stopped returning your calls.
That's right. I remember that. You said that New York City is a character in all your novels.
Well, critics have said that. Yeah, I mean, it's all my novels are set in New York. So yeah, it's and I think the protagonist. I think it's the antagonist in many of my novels.
As opposed to the protagonist?
Well, the protagonists are kind of working against New York or trying to deal with New York or cope with New York in some way. And, so, yeah, I guess in that sense it is a character. It's a major character in all my novels.
Have the changes in the last 20 years, has that influenced or affected how you write and what you write about?
Well, actually it has. I mean, let me just say that I'm a third generation New Yorker. My great grandfather came here, and my great grandfather was born on Lower East Side, and my grandfather was born on Avenue B and 9th Street behind St. Bridget's, which is still standing almost barely. And so I've always had a very strong historical sense of the city. And I myself was born in Manhattan in 1958, and it really is amazing how the different phases of New York. It's amazing to witness how New York has changed, and the New York that exists today, I must confess, I feel kind of lost in it a little bit. I don't feel, I don't feel familiar with it. It just seems strange, and the people seem strange. And I mean, I try to be open-minded, and I try to be accepting. I don't want to be a curmudgeon,
like me,
like you. And every day I say I must not be Bernie Mooney.
There you go.
But
I'm a guidepost.
You're
of
what?
Sorts. A guidepost of sorts.
Well, you're more like a big red, warning cone,
a cautionary tale.
Yeah, I kind of will go around the Bernie Mooney in this situation. So yeah.
Well, I came here in '82, officially.
Okay.
I had been coming here ever since I was a kid. And when I officially moved to New York, I think I caught the tail end of New York, of what New York is New York.
Well, it's interesting because, again, you have to pick your New York. But the New York that I was raised in, which was, I guess it was kind of towards the center of, or even a little late in the white flight stage, where a lot of a lot of areas beyond Midtown were just kind of caving in, and people were leaving, and and buildings and whole blocks were turning up vacant, and they were being kind of, I guess they refer to it as ghettofied, which kind of sounds a little bit racist because it sounds like, minorities came in and were menacing. When the truth of the matter is that these places were just empty, and anybody could fill them. I mean, if this was the more in the country, I think they would have been filled by deer and raccoons. So,
Okay.
But in any case, yeah, it was. So there was that, and then by '82, I think the city started turning around. We started seeing these areas that we never thought were going to come back,
right?
Beginning to these strange signs of life that were occurring. And I think in a way, I mean, the late '70s, early '80s, New York was really most conducive to creative types, and it was a wonderful period in that regard.
Because it was so rough and tumble?
Well, because it was affordable, and because it always attracted the kooks. I mean, a wonderful quote by Norman Mailer, who I rarely do quote, is that, New York was a place that attracted fuck-ups and who got together and did interesting things. Now, that was, that requires very little rent. So these places that were empty, you had these interesting, colorful types that came in, and they were able to get together and do these interesting things.
But New York always had those types for the whole 20th century, and it was only in the early 80s and then onward when it started become tougher and tougher to make it as a kook or an artist, because New York gave rise to many cultural movements.
Yeah, and I mean, on the other hand, I still feel like, the low rent stage of New York worked across the board. I mean, you had low rent rock and rollers like early punks. You had low rent, artists. Everything from, I guess from like the stage of Basquiat and that whole crew, the Andy Warhol imitators, and the East Village art scene, to a low rent theater scene, like you'd find with La Mama or the 4th Street Theater Row, a low rent film movement. They were all different areas and disciplines, and yet they were all relatively do-it-yourself, on the fly, cheap movements that kind of work concurrently, and there was some overlap between them in culture and so on. But the low rent was the common thread, and that's gone now. It's just.
Well, do you think part of the idea of a burned out city, fun city, that somehow created an urban art movement, as opposed to, say, back in earlier, like the de Koonings and everybody else, which actually seemed to be a little more of a middle class art movement?
Well, I mean, wait. You contrast between a city art movement or a low rent art movement or a poor art movement versus
right.
Well, I mean,
because the art in the '80s was a lot grittier.
Well, it's interesting because in some ways it was grittier. I mean, this has always been my kind of problem with. I mean, this is one of the things that kind of, I hate to use pretentious terminology. One of the things that inform my writing is I always felt that there was kind of a shortage of the city, at least in literature, and to a lesser degree, and maybe greater degree, in the other arts. Like you could see, like for instance, again, the East Village art scene, a lot of those abstract expressionists and so on, you don't see the city in them. You see a lot of interesting paint and interpretations and so on. But that's why I felt like there was a disservice to the city culturally, because you don't see that.
But wasn't it the city that fueled that creativity? The fact that all these people could live within close proximity to one another?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So it sort of was like a zeitgeist that everybody fed off each other?
Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, if you look at, I think, almost any great artist, you'll see they're very rarely isolated. They're usually within a movement. I mean, if you look at Shakespeare within the Elizabethan theater realm, or you look at any of the great Greek tragedians and so on, you'll see that there's a whole group of people working kind of in competition and kind of cooperation, and it kind of fuels them. And you'll rarely find, but you will sometimes find these isolated artists that work pretty much on their own on the outside. But so yes, there is definitely a culture that helps and encourages each other.
Who was that guy on the Lower East Side? Mm-hmm. He painted for like 40 years and he never showed anything. And then he moved. You know who I'm talking about?
Let's see. I need more.
There was just his wife Oh God, well, let's forget that.
Oh, okay, well, I'd love to know who.
Oh, man, I
that's
can't-
not the bank building that just opened up where that guy.
No,
just
no,
died.
no, it
Okay.
wasn't that guy.
Okay.
It was a guy I think he lived on like Houston and was really part of the art scene in like the 60s and early 70s, and then he just dropped out and holed up like a hermit in his apartment or building. He actually owned his building and just kept painting for like 40 years, then died.
Wow, you're gonna have to
Yeah.
give me that.
Maybe afterwards, after this, I'll mention.
Yeah. Well, let me know because I
I
definitely would.
guess I'm going to have to. So you touched on earlier about how you say you don't really know the city anymore than the one you grew up in. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Well, yeah. Just I mean, the buildings and the people and the streets and the and not even just those things. I mean, and let me just make a point that there's a book that just came out called St. Mark's is Dead about St. Mark's Place, and it kind of historically grapples with this question of culture and this notion of how the present day city is kind of anti-creative and so on. And I'm not going to go. I don't want to go too far with that. Like there really is a culture here, and there really are young artists and musicians and writers, and God bless them. And they're fighting against impossible odds to practice their work, and they need all the support.
But they're sort of all over the place. There aren't centers.
Well, they used to refer. There was a wonderful article in The Voice about 20 years ago by Cynthia Carr called the East Village Diaspora that basically showed how now, because these villages kind of been priced out, these little pockets. I mean, specifically, she was referring to. Kind of this burgeoning Williamsburg culture that has kind of continued, eastward into Bushwick and so on. So there are these little pockets that do exist, and I mean, in New York City with a subway system, they're able to unify and get together. So they're out there. God bless them. They've kind of gone under, So yeah, it's not as much as it used to be.
And speaking of new books, Ada Huxtable, is that the person?
Well,
aren't you all over the place in a book of hers?
Ada Huxtable, if I'm not mistaken, was like the architect critic.
Oh,
of
right.
The New York Times, like
well, who's the one? Who am I thinking of?
Oh, you're thinking of Ada Calhoun.
Oh, right.
That was the book I just
That's what I
referred
meant.
to.
Ada Calhoun.
Yeah, St. Mark's is Dead. Yeah, she just wrote that. The one I just mentioned.
Oh, that's the one you're all over.
Well, yeah, she interviewed me a little bit. I don't know if I'm all over it. I think there's about 2 or 3 citations in her book, but yeah, no, that's more than any other book I've been lately. So
right.
I'll take it. Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, so oh, wait a minute here. City on Fire.
Oh, City on Fire. Why do you have to bring that up?
I'd like to hear about that.
That's the novel that just got published by I forget who. And it was big in the literary world because it got a $2 million advance. A relatively young novelist that
Snot-nosed Kid.
Oh, that's he's just trying. It's interesting because I had a discussion about this recently with someone who, this guy wrote a 900-page novel. It's set during the 1977 blackout, and it's kind of one of those big, verbose, 25-cent word books that really, is a little over the top in terms of style. But the point is that if this book had been published by a small press or something like that, everyone would have said, everyone would have kind of gave him a slap on the back and said, "Good job." But because he got $2 million, and which of us would not gladly take $2 million if our agent could kind of spring that? I don't think he should necessarily be punished for it. On the other hand,
yes, he should.
Well, from the point of view of every writer who's out there who gets 0 to a minuscule advance after years of work.
Did he grow up in New York?
That's I don't think so, but I don't know. So
okay.
In any case, I know he was not. I mean, I think is in his mid-30s, and he writes about the '77 blackout, so he certainly wasn't around at that point.
Right.
But there's no, the controversy is more about, I think, the money than anything else. I mean, he's gotten more with with that one book than I think I have with all mine together. So it's So
you're not filthy rich. Being the actual New York City writer who writes about things as they happen and as you live them. I'm
beginning to realize that's more of a liability. I think there used to be a what was the famous phrase? Not ideas about the thing, but the thing itself.
Right.
I think the opposite is now true. Not the thing itself, but ideas about the thing are really what people are looking for. That's the whole postmodern thing.
Right.
It's the removal of the actual, the central object.
Oh, and you run a writing workshop.
I do have a writing workshop. We meet in the East Village on a weekly basis, usually Monday nights. And yes, we're open to new members if anyone's interested. There's a small fee, but it's pretty inexpensive. And everyone reads, and we all critique.
Oh, very nice. Very nice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What else did I have to ask you here? About getting back to the changing New York. You mentioned something a while back about people who live here now are more or less like tourists. That there's no connection to the city.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a good point. By the way, before we go on with that, let me just say that if anyone is interested in that writing workshop, you can contact me through my Facebook page. But and
that's Arthur Nersesian?
Yeah, well, it's pronounced a little differently, but I'll take that.
That's what my phone says.
Oh, I got to.
And it's Nersesian.
There you go. The tourist, the theory. I mean, this goes to the whole E.B. White thing that we talked about earlier. Which,
right.
The different types of New Yorkers, those who are here to stay versus those who are kind of slumping.
The three different types of New York. There's the commuter, the settler, and
is that
the native? The native. No, the settler was people like me.
Oh, okay.
Whose final destination was New York. I mean, my whole life led up to living in New York, becoming a New Yorker, being a part of New York, not bringing my crap.
Well,
I wanted to get away from that.
Well, but does he include? Correct me. But does he include a tourist? Is that a category in his thing?
No.
Okay, well that's interesting because I think the predominant New Yorker now is a tourist. And by tourist, I mean they're here for a few years, and then frankly, it does ring you out. I can't entirely blame them. You spend 5-10 years here. And you find that it's murder making an ever increasing rent, and it's difficult to maintain a community of friends because everyone is moving out and around, and you burn out. You look for kind of a calmer. It's certainly difficult to raise children. People do it, but it's I think it's a lot easier in the suburbs. And the point is that a lot of the friends that I knew in the East Village back in the late 70s, early 80s, the vast majority of them have moved on and usually out of the city. So it's,
even the native New Yorkers.
Even the natives. I mean, it's the thing is like at least my generation of New Yorkers, the concept of purchasing property was you didn't do it. It was a bad investment. New York City was something you did not want to put money into. And
had we only known.
Oh God.
That whole block where on 2nd Avenue and 3rd Street.
Yeah.
Those were all burned out. What's his name lives there?
2nd and 3rd Street.
The
Hell's Angels.
No, the composer.
Oh, you mean on the corner? You're talking about Glass?
Yeah, that's it. Philip Glass.
Yeah. I think he sold that building, the brownstone.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's a few doors down from the men's shelter.
Right. Well, that whole row was all burned out in like the early '80s, and a bunch of people like Philip Glass bought them for like $10,000, I think. Probably cost them $100,000 to renovate it to make it up to code and stuff. But
well, he supposedly started out as like a plumber. There's a famous story. I think it was Robert Hughes or someone who had written a review on him, and he shows up and like, "What are you doing here?" And he's like, "I'm the plumber." And I believe it was Glass who did the plumbing, and it's like, "But you're an incredible conceptual composer." He says, "Yeah, I need to pay the bills. I'm also a plumber. Where's the sink?"
Right.
So,
right. Exactly. So now we grew up, or you grew up, in the sort of dirty days of New York when it sort of started falling on hard times. Mm-hmm. Now that it's become nicer and safer, what have we lost?
Well, several things have happened because of that. I mean, before we talk about what we lost, I'd love to actually illuminate a little bit for the younger New Yorkers on the mindset of the older New Yorkers. The older New Yorkers feel like, we were here when the going was tough. We were here when no one would even step foot in, and we kind of kept a light on, and we made this place livable. And now we have to fight for rent stabilization, and we have to, kind of tiptoe around these kids who are paying much more than us and therefore feel more entitled. And I certainly would feel more entitled if I was paying a lot more than the older New Yorkers. But the point is, the older New Yorkers feel like, what the hell did we suffer for, so that we could kind of, feel unwelcome in our own surroundings. So that's just the mindset of it, not so much from a creative side as just the residential element of it. As far as what did we lose, I think that, there was much more of a value in locality. What really has happened in New York, aside from many of the younger New Yorkers, are this incredible franchisement and corporate, investment in New York. Where nowadays, notions of Rite Aid or all these things, they were not here back then. When the going was tough, they were nowhere to be found.
Speaking of Rite Aid, Walgreens just bought Rite Aid, so now they own basically all the chains, the drugstore chains.
Well, all those, like the notion of a bank near your house, or some kind of big corporate, any of these franchises that you see, they didn't have them back then. I remember when the Conrads moved over to Broadway and Waverly, and it was like everyone went over to see it. No one could believe. I remember when the McDonald's moved over on 3rd Avenue, and that was an event.
Well, the first ATM and bank on Avenue A was the EAB. That's when I knew the neighborhood was changing.
Well, that's the thing, and it's like you could bet your sweet ass that it was nice and safe before those places were able to plunk down any money and consider moving in. And every time a new one came in, we thought like, oh my God, can you believe that? One by one, I remember slowly all the big corporate chains kind of took off their place, and it was just. And finally, you reach this point where you realize, oh my God, what's going on? I remember when the Gap took over the St. Mark's Cinema.
Right.
And it became like a running joke. We've been gapped. So, those places that poured money into these neighborhoods that were otherwise destitute, those places had businesses in them. And those businesses, there was a lot of little hippie entrepreneurs, and there was a lot of little venues and bookshops. And it wasn't all peaches and cream. Some of them were crappy, and some of them were run down, and that's perfectly fine. But I guess it allowed at least the idea of a possibility that you could kind of have your piece of the American dream, whatever that was. I mean, I remember people, renting a little storefront and trying to sell whatever little knickknacks or whatever crap they had. And it was interesting because those little knickknack crap stores were very unique and different than any other knickknack crap store. You go to any Rite Aid or any of these other places, you're going to see any of the fast food chains, all the same menus anywhere. And if you're going to get the same service and the same choices that you get in the suburbs as you get in the city, then why not live in the suburb where at least it's cheaper? And I'm not telling people. I'm just saying.
I am telling people to move back to the suburbs.
Well, I myself
don't bring your shit here.
I'm saying I'll move back to the suburbs. I'm saying that if you suburbanize New York City, then it's not New York City. You've then killed the golden goose. It's like you might as well be the suburbs, and that's what we've done. We turned New York into the suburbs. So there's in that sense, people are getting cheated. They're paying so much more and getting so much less. And those interesting little colorful places that made New York, delightful and unusual and quirky and funny and weird and so on, all gone. I mean, now you're just living in this kind of bizarre suburban conquest of New York, And there are no individual... Well, I mean, there still are. I mean, the chains have taken over. New York always had its chain stores, its department stores. Yeah.
But like stuff like Lamston's. New York needs another Lamston's. You remember Lamston's?
I remember kind of Lamston's.
It was sort of like a general store. It was over on 6th Avenue.
Yeah.
Where I think a bank is.
Yeah, probably.
But anything you needed, you could go in there and you could get it. No matter how obscure. There still is that place on 7th Street, across from Tile Bar. It's like ostensibly a garden place. What's the name of it?
Oh, you're talking about the Sharif's hardware store?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that was Jack's hardware store, and then Sharif, whatever his name.
Right, and I remember when I lived down the street from there, being able to go in and get any weird, obscure thing, like I had, I found or inherited in an ancient vacuum cleaner.
There you go.
Where do you get the bags? So I walk in there and I say, hey, do you have the bags for this weird blah, 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 blah? They went, oh yeah, over here.
Well, that was like Kamenstein's, which was there for like 50 years. It was a huge hardware store.
That where St. Mark's Books just moved from?
Yeah, it's basically now the dormitory for Cooper Union. It's on 9th Street and
I thought you were going to say for NYU.
No,
I was going to say what isn't.
Oh my God. Well, But the point is that you go in there and you could buy a single unusual screw that only fit with some kind of object. A million little drawers that you have to kind of go through to find it, and how much you didn't need a whole bag. You just need the one screw. Okay, that's 3 cents.
Right.
I mean, forget those places are gone. But it was a marvel to go into. Anyway.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we're doing this recording in Williamsburg, where I now live. I lived in Manhattan the whole time, until like 8 years ago, since I moved here, and then I basically got kicked out, so to speak, and I couldn't wait to get back to Manhattan. And then after a few years, I'd go back there. I realized, nah, I'm happy here.
Yeah, no, it's...
I do live in the compound. There is that. But even though it's the hipster central, it's still more of a neighborhood. There's still a little more old school New York type places and a sense of community, with
Absolutely.
local merchants and stuff like that.
Well, I'll tell you what's happening. You know how there's kind of the seismic shifts to the continents, and there's constant motion of.
Right.
There's also a kind
tectonic
of
shift.
Tectonic. Thank you. There is a economic tectonic shift, and what's happening is Midtown basically is pushing outward.
Right.
Because the East Village is now Midtown, basically.
Yeah.
It's Midtown extent. And I hate to say it, but Williamsburg is now kind of outer East Village. I mean, by all cultural rights from like my 1985 index,
right?
You're basically on
and that's the Narcissian index.
The Narcissian index.
That's right.
But this is you're on 8th Street and maybe First Avenue right now.
Right, right.
And I'm in the East Village. I'm actually probably on I'm probably on 30th Street and Park or something like that.
Right.
Because that's where the economy was, and that those types of people were kind of restrained to, and that's what's happening. New York is pushing outward, But I also believe will happen in the same way that the universe expands, is it eventually also it contracts.
Right.
And in as much as I've seen this city when it was basically a small island of city surrounded by kind of a large ghetto.
Right.
I think eventually someday, whatever economic forces at work occur, it's going to go back to that, and you're going to see all this stuff is going to, I don't know what forces will occur, but it may be the same forces that occurred 60 years ago, where people said, "Why are we paying all this money and living in this big, busy pile of shit when there's all this kind of calm place, and there's the modes of transportation is pretty quick, and we can have, we don't have to see our kids getting, I don't know." robbed by landlords as well as possibly muggers, and it's like there were better places to live.
Well, 60 years ago, this was actually a decent place to live.
Right, no, that's true. But there was this huge exodus to the suburbs. I guess it was the penchant for plants and stuff like that, and space. So
or immigrants,
because
once they made it, they moved out.
Exactly. Well, I just think that's got to happen again eventually. At some point, there's going to be kind of a mass disillusionment, and people are going to. And the thing is that most people do work in masses, and they do work. They basically are herd animals, and when people start moving out, then they're going to want to move out, and it's I think we're going to see that at some point, and real estate prices are going to come down,
right?
And then I think that wasn't just a single anomaly. I think that's the cycle. So
well, that's the thing. I mean, even I have thought like, I got to get the hell out of here.
Yeah, well, me too.
But there was one major stumbling block. Where the hell would I go? I mean, despite the fact that we're bitching and moaning about it.
Yeah.
Well, that's a New York thing,
Well, it's not. I can't afford.
It's the bitch about it.
The East Village that is now there is not the East Village I was attracted to 30 whatever years ago, and the point is I wouldn't go there now. It's just too.
Oh no!
It's scary, and the point is, if I could afford to, if it was because my rent stabilization, I'm kind of stuck there. Musical chairs and the music has stopped, and that's the chair I'm sitting in. But if I could leave, I would probably go to I don't know. I like outer Queens. I like not even outer. Sunnyside, Woodside, Elmhurst. Jackson Heights, all that is nice to me, and the houses still look like houses, and there's still some affordable storefronts for interesting things, and even culturally, there's it is NYU land where I am,
right?
And that's not an artistic thing. That's kind of a scary thing. So the point is, like, I would actually prefer. There's actually, I think, more artistic types in these outer areas now.
Well, they have to.
Yeah, they can't afford that.
And right? I think that the pricing in New York has also fueled creative and cultural centers in the rest of the country, because no longer can they afford or need, especially with the new technology,
Right.
they no longer need to come to New York.
Exactly.
You know, they can create their own thing. So, I don't know.
Well, what's sad is, like, you know, I mean, I remember I actually lived in San Francisco for a few years in the it's from 69 to 72. And basically...
That's when you lived in that hippie hotel on Haight Street?
Well, I didn't hate the street, but yes. But the point is that it was interesting seeing a kind of youthful, exciting, you know, creative city that was still kind of coming up. And you know, I think that a lot of people, you know, it's interesting because more and more I've been hearing people talk about Detroit that way. Like New York, Detroit has kind of bottomed out.
Well, Patti Smith said to move to Detroit. Or Poughkeepsie.
Well, yeah. Oh, I didn't hear Poughkeepsie.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
2 burned out old industrial towns.
Well, that's the thing. And it's like, you know, I mean, the thing about an artist is that I don't know what income streams or revenue streams there are out there. That's the big problem, because you do need to eat. You know, you need somehow to pull some money in. But those would be probably the places that I would kind of aim if I were starting out now, you know.
Yeah.
So,
but it just seems sad that, you know, a lot of these people call us nostalgists. You know, it's, oh, you're thinking of this old nostalgia of New York. It's like, no, I'm thinking of New York when it was still New York. That's the end of part 1 of my conversation with Arthur Nersessian. Join me next time when we finish up this conversation on Mr. Haney's Truck. Thanks for listening.